All right, guys, welcome back to the Untitled Fitness podcast. Today on the show, I have Hayden Pritchard. For those of you guys who are aware or not aware, Hayden is a researcher in New Zealand, mostly known for his research on peaking and tapering for powerlifting. And this is something that I think has honestly really changed a lot since raw powerlifting got to be more popular. In the past, the old adage or the old philosophy was just rest for a week. Um,
Mm.
and there's reasons for that. Obviously, we can delve into that. But now things have gotten to be a little bit more nuanced with peaking and tapering. And I can say, for example, with myself, what I used to do with all my old coach was I would have my heaviest week for that's my time to peak. Then the next week would be my taper week, and we try to maintain that strength I kind of built on that week. But for this last meet, and what I've been doing also more often with my athletes is lining up like meet week with when they're regular are strongest from their training program. I find that's like a little bit more very predictable, and there's like less tapering with that too. And like things have changed quite a bit. But Hayden is kind of the man that I think understands a lot of the context and the nuance behind why you might choose something for different athletes. So I guess I wanted to first I guess going off of what I just said. Um, have you found that those are like the two most common methods of tapering that you might use with a raw powerlifter, or what have you seen usually work best for people?
I guess a big thing with it is as you already kind of alluded to it, it does really depend on the individual and kind of taking the time to get to understand how and what they respond to best. And you talked about some concepts there around like time to peak and those sorts of things as well, which obviously play into this because probably one of the biggest things when we think of the taper and one of the things that can have the biggest influence on the taper is actually what style of training the athlete does prior to that, right? Like we can't just go ahead and say, this is how you must taper because actually what you've done prior to that is going to dictate fully what that taper has to look like. Um, Training that is really high stress and really high volume, maybe those sort of athletes that are training in that way will need bigger reductions in training volume or training load. Whereas if someone's training and making gradual, steady progress and there's some sort of reliable metric that at 4 weeks or 5 weeks of a training block, they hit their heaviest lifts. It is kind of a thing of if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? We can have a lot of this kind of I guess, data and scientific studies, but we have to remember that that's all in a specific context, in a specific training program at a specific time. And so, yeah, short way to say
Right.
there's nuance, mate. But I mean, it's pretty typical in what we've seen in the studies and things. The major focus of almost any tapering strategy that is effective is a reduction in training volume. In terms of what lifters choose to do with training intensity, that tends to be a little bit more variable, but most people will substantially reduce training volumes. And some of the numbers that we see in the literature, anywhere from sort of like 30 to 70%, and some of those
Right.
studies have shown to have good results, and that's across a range of different studies using a range of different, prior training methods. So I guess the main thing there is coming back to that heart of what are we trying to achieve during a taper, right? We're trying to maximize performance on a specific day, a specific point in time. And therefore, what we need to try and do really is ensure that the athlete doesn't carry too much fatigue into that day, but they are able to hold on to their training adaptations that they've achieved over the course of, months, weeks, years, whatever it may be that that athlete has been training for that particular event for. So I don't know if I've necessarily answered your question there, mate, but
Well, we
that
have
that would
50
be
minutes
probably
to
one,
expound.
yeah, one
I
of
guess
those
like
things that I
going
would say.
going over that, because they're basically, I would say, like, for example, like when I'm programming for a lifter, like usually like that, I mentioned with like the 4 week build, and then that last week is the
Mm,
taper. It's kind of built in with like we're gonna have some overreaching, for
yeah.
example, and then potentially that's going to result in higher training performance. Versus the other one has kind of come out of some with research like kind of indicating that, maybe you actually have gotten that same place without fatigue. So I'm like my
Yeah,
main
yeah,
issue with
yeah.
that is that I feel like that's less like, for example, like myself, the amount of fatigue I accumulate when I'm really pushing hard, like even if I'm strong reliably on like a week four,
Mm,
I can't get around that. Like there's that fatigue is going to mask my strength by, maybe bench press is like only 1%, but 1% for me is, another 2.5 kilos on my bench press, and that matters to me, or up to 10% on my deadlift. And so I guess the talk of like, fatigue masking performance, do you think that like there is something to be gained by like, I guess first off, is it possible to like peak without feeling like that level of fatigue and like really have your best performance? Because like I've found that for a lot of people, like they just get more fatigued during peaking blocks.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess that will come back to how a lifter responds to higher intensities because typically as we get closer to a meet, right, you're going to be typically lifting at higher intensities. And I know for me, especially like nowadays, anytime that we do a training block where I am lifting singles or doubles, those sorts of heavier lifts, and I'm working at maybe, it could be anywhere to be fair, mate, from a 7 to a 9 RPE, but the lifts are heavier than what I would typically do
Right.
with variations. It's the specific stuff. I tend to just carry more niggles and, things just tend to flare up for me as soon as I'm doing that higher intensity. And so I guess it's probably comes back to the type of training we're doing because I don't know if you've heard Mike T talk about his example with Brett Gibbs back in
Yeah.
the day
Yeah.
when he used to do quite low intensity
Hmm.
deadlifting and then he would literally just lift a single on the day. He wouldn't do this traditional kind of like, 5, 3, 2, 1 or whatever it might be that you would do with your progressive increases in intensity. So probably to say it's probably pretty typical that people when they are lifting with a higher intensity, which is the traditional or typical way that we would probably do, a block of training close to competition, there probably are some inherent challenges with that in terms of the body because it's handling heavier loads than it has previously. It's not used to doing that. And so potentially that is what you're feeling with that, I guess. Um,
Yeah. Well, I guess like
would that be
to give
accurate?
like, well, yeah, I mean, let's give some context around it. So, like for example, like for myself, like I need two blocks of singles in order for me to really feel prepared. The first one is going to be probably around, it's an RPE 9, something that's
Yeah.
close to my max. And how I program it is basically I try to find like on my week 3 what I would call the anchor point, which is like the lightest weight I can lift to still feel prepared for my
Mm.
heaviest week of training. And so, like for example, on my deadlift, it's around 90%. Well, if I am doing that block, and it's going to be a lighter percentage, obviously a lighter load if I'm going for RPE 9 versus if I'm doing that method I was talking about where, if I'm
Yeah.
trying to get ready to deadlift, 325 kilos, like I have to deadlift significantly heavier, something closer to
Mm.
like what I was doing like the RPE 9 going into the meet. And like that's how I think like a lot of times like that's like when I think maybe, the conversation of so I was listening to Eric Thomas talk about this on Dave Tate's podcast that like because of the central fatigue and the overall like systemic fatigue from the heavier weights coming is higher, like that's when we might start to pull back more of the accessory work to let
Mm.
you recover better because you're just accumulating more systemic fatigue. That's kind of what I think is like one of the parts of it. And second off, it's the psychological stress of a deadline and kind of like worrying about what you can hit and thinking you need like a certain number in training.
I think
Like if it
that
was
is
like I'm
honestly one
gonna
of the that
yeah.
to me, I reckon, like what you hit there is one of probably the big reasons I think almost why many of us would probably lift too heavy in training, almost right. Like if you're wanting to hit your best on the meet day, right? You kind of feel like you need to be hitting at that or near that prior to comp to feel confident to hit it. And it is one of those things of is that a like physiological necessity or something that you actually need to do to be prepared to lift that weight? Or is that a psychological thing where it's more for your mental
Psychology.
preparedness?
Yeah.
Yeah, like is there I mean, there's bound to be some sort of mixture of both of those things, and there's probably no one right answer for every person. But I do notice that a lot of times people will tend to push things a little bit more than they may have otherwise. They might be progressing really nicely, but then near meet day they have to test a little bit and they have to go a bit more. And then what that does is that probably takes away your ability to continue to do the things that you were doing to get stronger, right? And the lead up to that, because you're expending all this energy, mental energy on actually trying to focus on, right, I need to hit a 310 or 315, whatever it is in training, so that I'm confident that I can chuck on another 10 kilos on meet day, or even I need to hit near that number to feel like I can hit that at meet day. So maybe there's a little bit of two things happening there potentially.
I think that's like one of the reasons like why to like for example like I know for example my last thing I went too heavy on squat because like I just didn't
Mm,
really feel that good. Like I also like you can kind of tell like too like what's a really problematic amount of fatigue you're like I'm going to only be able to like retain my performance. I think that's kind of really important to identify too as far as how heavy and how hard you push somebody. I think that's one of the biggest differences with like the training leading in to a meet for like a
mm,
heavier versus a lighter lifter. Heavier lifter is going to probably they can't go as heavy, or if they are going to go heavy they're going to need more time to taper off of that fatigue, so it's like an entire block out. And then they have a higher intensity reduction because they need that for their nervous system to recover. Whereas like a lightweight 60-kilo female, like she can just eat things up, and if you taper her off more than like one session, it's like she's gonna just be really really flat.
And I guess we don't have any really good data, like because you mentioned in one of the messages we had yesterday, I think it was, around that kind of query around the heavier and lighter lifters. And I think a lot of what we talk about with that is, anecdote. There's not really a good, strong consensus in the data, at least that there is a real, just, big difference. But I'm of the opinion in general anyway that, our data gives us like a direction of where we should go and what we could do. But in fairness, we always need to respond to what we see in front of us. And so one of the things that I consistently have said in the literature that we've written is one of the best things that a coach can do is keep records of what an athlete has done. And one of the things that I think, every coach should be doing really is ensuring that they have actually trialed and tested things in training. Like if you have a heavier week coming up, maybe you could try a different tapering strategy to what you might have done in the past, or you could try, not tapering and just, having your heavy week be that week and maybe have a couple of days off before, whatever it is. Like try these things, look at trial and error and see what
Hmm.
works. If you remove your accessory work completely, does that actually lead to a better meet performance for you? If you leave a little bit of it in, does that make you feel a little bit more prepared on meet day? Like one of the things I've probably changed with the way that I tend to taper is that I will often keep a really, really low dose of accessory work in that week of the meet, but it's like one hard set, like it's not
Right.
much. It's like whatever your, I guess, most bang for buck accessories are. Say there's some really important upper back stuff that you do that it just makes you feel good and strong and whatever it is, like it's the stuff you always have in there that you find helps build your strength. Like don't just get rid of it 2 weeks out. Like keep it in, but pull it back, scale it back, do one set rather than four. Like there's all these
Right.
sorts of ways that you can kind of play with these variables. And like in the literature, as I said, we tend to see that it's a main thing about volume reduction as a whole. And all the studies that we've, looked at with that, that's looking at your entire reduction in training volume, including everything. So that could be accessory work gone, plus
Right.
reductions in your main sets. Like, so you're thinking of the total training program, like how many hard sets, and I think most of those, to be fair, didn't even use hard sets, if my understanding is correct in my memory, is that it's, the load times reps times sets. So it's like your whole tonnage type scenario is what we're talking about
Hmm.
when we talk about a volume reduction. And that is across the board. So if you're reducing 70% of training volume, but the majority of that's accessory, you could still be doing quite a lot of main lift work. But then if you keep a bit more of the accessory and you've reduced a bit more of the main lift. So just kind of to think about that in context when we talk about a
Yeah.
volume reduction. Yeah.
I think that's really important. One thing that I always look at, Hayden, is like how much more is like the lifter driven by like technique versus like muscle. And I
Yeah.
think anyone who's like done the sport for a while can know what that looks like. Like the technical driven lifter, the
Mm,
really wide stance sumo, the high arch bencher, really wide stance or very upright squatter versus someone who's like very muscularly driven. And usually you'll find with those programs is that the person that muscularly driven is essentially saying they have really bad leverages for lift. In general, or they, whatever. And in my experience with that, it's like they generally have like less comp lift volume
mm,
anyways. And so they might actually rely more on the accessory work. And you keep that in more for them to actually feel strong. Like
yeah.
for example, I've done blocks for like, I've taken out half squat.
Mm,
And like even though everything else in my squat programming stays the same, my squat just doesn't go up. It just doesn't go up. And all
yeah.
that's because I'm very hingy and I don't really load my quads. And so like it's like if I'm going into my meet, even if it's really light, if I feel really good, if I'm better to do some half squat, or so I'm probably not going to feel like the same way that I
Mm,
do. Versus someone who is very like I'm very upright sumo deadlifter. Like I'm probably not going to change that much of their up and intensity work. Like it might stay
yeah.
exactly the same, and then most of it's going to be like a really big reduction in volume. And because they're not really getting much of that axial fatigues, they're so upright, and they're relying a little bit more on their legs. Like I might just keep letting a lot of their posterior chain work anyways. I think it's kind of just comes down like asking the athlete like how do they feel from like a central versus like a peripheral fatigue perspective. And
Mm,
if I'm firstly asking my clients like how sore do you feel? How and compared to like normal, as far as like peripheral fatigue, is that affecting your ability to like hit the right positions? Because one of the things I've really realized as a coach is that sometimes the bad technique habits that you see people have is because they're just fatigued. They
mm,
just are hesitant to load the muscles. Versus like that central fatigue is like you just feel exhausted all the time and things just feel heavy on your back. And like that's when I'm
yeah.
like lower down the intensity a little bit more. Like that's kind of what I would look at as far as like volume versus intensity. I also think it's important to like us, going back to like the psychology perspective of tapering. I remind myself this all the time. So I always feel like crap going every single meet. I'm like the volume reduction is going to lower down the fatigue and
Yeah.
trusting that. And that's the majority of the of the
And
taper.
the other thing you get with that as well, Adam, is like oftentimes people will like, and that's just one of the other reasons I quite like keeping a little bit of accessory work in, is because if you change too much, people start to question everything. Like they start to doubt what's happening, and because it doesn't feel like normal or natural or what they normally do when they go into the gym, and it just feels so different, people kind of get that like I don't know, is it like a fear, like that this isn't
Mhm.
working right because I'm not doing what I normally do. My routine's not the same. I haven't done my pull downs this week, like whatever it might be, like that kind of thing where people start to question everything and then they go in this little sort of like spiral, and I feel sore or whatever it might be, right? Because during the week of a taper, like it is pretty common that, especially if you've trained pretty hard leading up to a taper week, you're not going to feel amazing. And part of the other thing that I think is really important to reinforce is that you don't actually have to feel amazing to perform really well. Like some of my
Absolutely.
best, lifts have happened when I actually don't feel particularly good going into that session. And that's not saying just push through if you feel like shit. Like, no, no, no. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is like you can feel a little bit subpar and still turn up and actually put on a really, really good performance. It's not that uncommon, and you don't have to feel like a box of chocolates to be able to walk in on the day and like absolutely smash a meet. You can actually feel a little bit tighter, a little bit sore, or not quite fresh, or whatever it is, and perform really well. And like to be fair, man, like feeling good um, can be quite a rare thing, right? Oftentimes,
Oh,
we always
absolutely.
have a little bit of soreness here or tightness there, or, mentally doesn't feel quite right. So, like, trusting that process to a little bit of an extent is really important. And especially if you're trying something different or new in the taper, like, you might feel a little bit different to what you did last time, but that doesn't necessarily, it might, but it doesn't necessarily mean that things are going to go really, really poorly. It might just be because it is different, so you feel different, and to you that feels uncommon. Like there's that other piece of the puzzle with this whole tapering thing is that, yeah, we're often acutely aware of how we feel during a taper, so much more so than any
Yes,
other time during our
absolutely.
training cycle,
Yes.
because we're asking that question all week. Do I feel better? Do I feel fresher? Am I freshening up? My coach said I'll be feeling good. Like all of those things go through your mind, and so I think that kind of almost leads to a little bit of like I don't know if sensitization is the right word, but
Yeah.
you're assessing everything too much. You're being a little bit, too aware of everything. Whereas normally when you're just focusing on getting, whatever the prescribed thing is in the day in the gym, it's a different kind of mental state to be in.
Yeah, so I first off like 100% agrees. I tell my clients that like for me I was like, oh my God, I don't feel great all the time. I'm like, you when do you ever feel great? Like when you're
Yeah, yeah.
powerlifting, like let's be honest, in any sport you're gonna feel some degree of fatigue. What matters mostly is like the trends leading up to
Mm,
that point because like it's and then learning from things and like seeing like where your threshold is as far as like how heavy do I need to go, which is why I love how you kind of were just talking about so much about like it depends so much on what you're doing in training. And
yeah.
most of the really good coaches now, like they just try to make that training as productive and predictable as possible. Because if you're showing up in training, you don't have to make very big changes. And like what you mentioned about with the not having to like make big changes, the clients are more confident. And if they
Mm,
don't feel for like, excessively beat up when they're going into their taper week, I think that psychology also plays a lot into the
yeah.
tapering part of like how much better that you do, how much more strength you're going to produce. But like for example, if I feel like really crappy, um, like like subconsciously, even though like if it wasn't like mentally like in my head, like I could like exert more just the amount of force because I'm kind of tired. I'm kind of sore.
Mm.
My bench press, whatever. I'm not thinking about as much. I'm not pushing my chest up to the bar like that happened to me today. I'm like, why does this feel worse? I'm like, you're being lazy because you're tired,
Not focused.
and
Yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, exactly. And I think that like that's why like I think that it's about identifying to like that tipping point of fatigue with all of
Mm.
your lifters too. As far as like how heavy can they go before they kind of start to tip over the edge. Mm.
Yeah, and that's always going to be different, right? Like that's one of the things that I always think and come back to when you're looking at, especially something like that can be as individualized and the response can be so varied to something like a taper. Like we have guidelines or we have like an idea of where we should go in terms of reduce volume, maybe change the intensity slightly, but there's no like, here's the taper plan.
Yeah.
You're going to hit this on Monday, this on Wednesday. Make sure you avoid that on these days. Like, there literally is nothing like that you can just roll with. Like, you might have some sort of a week that I guess, and a lot of coaches probably will. Like, this is my typical type of taper week that you will try with someone, right? And you'll see, oh yeah, their bench didn't work as well, or this didn't work as well, and so therefore I'm going to try this next time. But we'll maintain this for the squat because they hit numbers I've never hit before, whatever it is. Like, and then you kind of have to like build this puzzle as you go. And so that's probably one of the things that like I encourage people to do is don't just look at what someone says that they do and try and replicate that because you might be really, really different. And that could even be with the exact same training prior, right? You could almost have the exact same training dose prior, but actually how you respond to that last week or those last 2 weeks could be quite different. And part of it might actually come back even to that psychology piece that we've talked about there already. Like is, what makes you feel most confident as you head into that meet week is going to be really important.
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about like like Brett, for example, like he might part of that fatigue he feels with like the singles is like the the expectation around singles and like, oh my
Mm,
gosh, like this is a heavy single, and you get like more like in your head about it, and then it makes you perform worse because you're in your head about it. Versus you get him like a volume set of five, it's like you're more like process oriented
mm,
with training. I think that's a large portion of it. Versus like one of the things I see with singles too is like if I have like a single in the program, or it's like that carrot dangling, where like lifters take everything more seriously with their like
yeah,
training and their
yeah.
sleep and their stress. But they're like, oh, this is a heavy weight. Versus like a triple, it's like it's starting at like 80%, and you're like, like it's 80%. Like I'm not really going to really take that as seriously. Um, I guess like because people are
That's
gonna want,
honestly, mate, just want to jump in on that one there because
yeah,
that's one of the things that I think for me in my training over this past year, like as you know, I'm a dad, couple of kids, life looks a lot different to what it did when I was, powerlifting at my best. But I've noticed that these days I do so much better when I don't have or I haven't put that like pressure on myself to perform well. And so a lot of my training for the last 6 months or a year has probably been lower, like RPE wise, than what people would say you need necessarily for strength, maybe, or some people would say that you need for strength. But like I've been progressing nicely. The body's been feeling pretty good. Like, and I haven't got that pressure on myself to be like, I have to hit this number or it needs to be here. Like literally come in, I'm like, yeah, I know I can do that for a set of five. Or I know I can do that for a set of three. Oh yeah, that's gonna be fine for this. Like and then as you mentioned about focusing on the process, like that's probably been the thing. I've been able to focus on technique. I've been able to focus on moving, with intent on each of the repetitions and things and not thinking, am I going to hit this? And it's been a really
yeah.
interesting phase of training because back in the day, I would have felt like I had to push closer to failure and had to push harder, which maybe actually took away from some of those things around force development and moving better and those sorts of things. So yeah, it's an interesting one because I've kind of found that actually I respond pretty well to a lower RPE training. And maybe that is partially due to what you've just said there around the expectations that you place on yourself when you go into the gym. I can come in a lot more relaxed. I can keep focused on the process. I'm not thinking, oh, I've got to get to this for my top set, or I really want to push that, RPE 8 single up a little bit this week, like those sorts of things. And I mean, there's a time and a place for that, right? I'm not a high level competitive weight powerlifter at the moment. So take that for what
Well,
it is. But as someone who's getting stronger and building back to where I was, like it is nice and interesting as well to note that I can do that without having to destroy myself. Yeah.
how I identify like how I conceptualize powerlifting and like when I'm determining like specificity that an athlete needs versus accessory work, I look at like, is this person's technique really good? Like, do they feel
Mm,
confident under the bar? Does the bar not feel super heavy in their hands or on their back? And I just basically like, okay, well, I'm going to put in as much comp work and intensity and volume as I need to for that lifter to feel like really strong. Like something I've found
confident. Yeah.
with bench press that works really well is just like, instead of higher frequency, you give it like more higher intensity like exposures, like during the week. And instead of adding a third squat day, try adding another top set on.
Mhm.
That's one to three reps on the secondary, and then I look at, well, how much muscle does this person have, and then how much is that part of the long-term athletic development that's holding them back. And I think then one of the biggest things with like is I relate with you with the, I guess, not having those expectations on
Mhm.
myself is just like I understand there's timing. Strength is all about timing, and it's like working with your body. It's like, I mean, I'll just, who Angelo for Fortino is.
What was that? Sorry.
You know who Angelo Fortino is?
Rings a bell, but I'm not sure why.
He's a very, very strong 82 and 82 and a half lifter. He's one of the only ones that to
Yeah.
squat 700 pounds. But I was listening to him talking with his coach on the Twilight's podcast about how he feels during
Mm.
training. Like, I feel pretty crappy until week four. I feel pretty crappy until week four. And like that's just how it is. And so I
Mm.
think that like, and he just understands that, having like that trust in like a system and like a process, and understanding that like, there's a certain amount of stress that we all need to get stronger. But it's
Yeah.
about like not going too high. And especially I think with people that are, I think like the people that are have less life stress, they can handle more of that intensity. But people that are like
100%.
more
Yeah.
stressed out, it's like for me, it's like your dad in your business and research, like your mental fatigue in like, I think mental fatigue is like, it affects your central fatigue like the most. It's like I always am like I can have like a pretty mentally demanding day. I'm mostly bodybuilding work, like a back day, I'm good to go. And then like nothing phases that. But if I have like a single on squat, I'm like it could be like 5, 10% weaker than it should be.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I fully
So
agree with that.
as
That's an interesting point, that whole like what people do outside of their training and how you can kind of still maximize results. And that one that you mentioned there about being able to turn up and do like a bodybuilding focus day or something for the back, but a heavy single day would be affected. And that's something I'm thinking about with designing my, upcoming training as I kind of think about like what life might look like. I'm kind of thinking, I'm probably going to have to try and schedule like my week around the fact that weekends are probably going to be the best time to go heavy. During the week, I, might have to
oh
do early
yeah.
morning sessions. So maybe I just do like some bodybuilding stuff during the week and just focus on actually the, push close to failure, go pretty hard, but they're accessory movements. They're not mentally demanding, like, and try and structure the week in a way that actually is almost like periodized across the week,
Yeah.
to fit in with what does the mental demand look like on these days of the week? When am I going to be freshest to actually be able to focus and push in the gym? And how can I kind of align the training plan with the mental state or the capacity that I might have to exert on that given day based on what life has. Like it's a different way to do it because typically, I would have squat bench, days, focused on those sort of movements. But I'm like, maybe I need to kind of switch this up. So actually I have, you know, the days that are focused on lifts and the days that are focused on like building function, capacity, muscle, all that sort of stuff, and separated out by that, which would be different to what I've done in the past. But it's an interesting experiment, and even just having a thought experiment about it, like it may not need to go there because the week might not become that demanding, but it's an interesting approach of that. How could individualization look based on what we know about principles of training and even that psychology of training to ensure that the individual in front of you can actually take that work and handle it, right?
Mhm. With an approach like that, like, because I have lots of lifters that are like that, like, who work with like, the ER or something like that. And
Yeah,
like, what I always think about is like, I think it's, it's so important as a coach to have your own conceptual frameworks around principles. Because for me, if I'm
yeah,
programming a secondary day, there's two things I'm thinking about for a lifter. I'm like, the main purpose is so that we don't detrain. That's the main reason.
yeah,
And so I'm going to ask them, how much intensity do we need to touch in order for them to feel strong, like
mm,
neuromuscularly strong? And then how much volume and practice work and sets do we need to have for them to feel confident in the movement pattern where it's, that subconscious competence. We're not thinking about everything that you're doing on
yeah,
the primary day. Um, and for some people, they have to do a lot more work. For other people, they just don't. And in my opinion, it's like, well, what's the biggest thing they can do other than that? It's do more accessory work or rest,
mm,
because I think you have to like keep the goal there. And I think that's
yeah,
also like, if we're talking about like the microcycle design, that's important with the taper too, because you kind of need to go off of those trends. Because if I am programming a taper, and if I have like, say, someone like, squats on Monday heavy and they deadlift on Wednesday heavy and they bench on Friday heavy, and their meet is on Saturday. What I do is I line up that secondary day with the typical amount of rest they would have going
yeah,
into their primary day. It was like I think that's really important for strength. Like,
working
if they have
backwards.
3 days
Yeah, yeah,
off for like for their squat, I'm going to be like, what do they normally do in that last session leading up to the regular heavy squat as usually the exact strongest? And I'll usually
yeah,
keep that same intensity because that it tells me that's what they need to feel strong instead of PR or whatever we're trying to do. And then what I'll do is I might follow the volume guideline reductions, like you said, of like 30 to 70%, depending upon how much fatigue that lift really drives with the person. And that depends so much on leverages and weight on the bar. And that's like, I think understanding that has actually been what's made my tapering the easiest, because there's a very rare circumstance where I'm tapering more than one session now.
yeah,
Like that's usually what I found works the best. If I taper on multiple sessions, we're not getting any performance improvement. We are
mm,
stat fatigue that like we need to pull back. It's kind of like I have this like analogy to deloads. Like you might feel good after deload, but it's deloads aren't really made with the intent that we're going to feel strong after. Just like we just want to wash out fatigue, and we have a week one of training that's just not that heavy. Tapers are different because we're trying to be as strong as possible, and
mm,
so um again, like, and that's like how much better are you really going to feel from one day off? Like you're not going to feel fresh, but you're going to feel better, and it should be good. And then as you look at that last program or that last session as far as accessory work, that's also what I would only taper off too, is that last session of accessory work, because I just think that predictability is so important. I think that when, like you said, when you change too many things, it's less predictable.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah. And
does
I
that
would
match what kind of
largely
what you do?
largely agree with what you're doing. And I mean, when you say session, are you meaning sort of it's almost like the last sessions within that like 6 days or 7 days prior to the meet? Because obviously that's your session, then you'd have one for each of the lifts in between, or how do you kind of structure that
Yeah,
one?
so let's say that I guess like if I was giving a concrete example, for myself, my primary squat day is on a Saturday, and
Yeah,
then my secondary day is on Tuesday. And so what I
yeah,
would do is say, okay, I have 3 days of rest before my Saturday session,
yeah,
and like it already kind of goes with that. I guess actually sorry, that's the bad example. Deadlift. My secondary day is on Saturday, and then my primary day is on Wednesday.
yeah,
And so what I would do is I would put in like that same amount of rest, like on like a Tuesday, for example, but
yeah.
and then I would lower down the volume on that session. Usually, like if I'm doing like a deadlift, you taper it pretty heavily. Like
Yeah.
it's like three singles, like a conventional deadlift. But it's like RPE five, like a last warm up. And then if they need to do like two lighter sets, I'll do that too. Um,
Mm.
but it's mostly just pulling off of that last session
Yeah,
because
yeah, yeah.
like I don't want to pull things off too much.
So it's almost like your last microcycle gets reduced
Exactly.
for the specific lift, essentially, or for each lift.
Essentially.
But then that day or that timing dictates based on what you've previously done with that lifter because you know that that part
Exactly.
works. Yep, yep,
Yes,
yep.
because I've identified that on a secondary day, that's what they need to feel strong. And
Mm,
so if you follow the trends of like how I would increase intensity, because like I know that like one of the biggest mistakes people make is that they just lower intensity. They're like, I'm going to train
mm.
really light and I'm going to
Yeah,
feel strong. I'm
yeah,
like,
yeah,
no,
yeah,
like that's not how your body works.
yeah.
That's why you do singles most of the time going into a meet. Like that's kind of what I do as far as when I'm tapering, was it just makes it a lot easier and it just comes down to like, okay, that's the intensity that we need. That's what I maintain, and then I'll lower down the volume according to how beat up that they feel. Um, yeah, just I hope, does that make sense?
Yeah,
I can
and I
send you
like
some
it.
examples
It
like in
sounds
the
kind of
DMs too
like you're
after
doing
this.
a step taper, which is what most like when we've done
Exactly.
the surveys on powerlifters. That's typically the type of taper they use because there's these different ways that you can taper, right? There's the step taper, which essentially we're operating at this level of training, and we
Exactly.
instantly reduce. So we might be
Yep.
doing, let's just make it simple, 4 sets, 4 work sets here. We drop it back and we just do two the week of the
Yep.
meet or whatever it might be, right? Like that's how you would do a step taper. A linear taper would be like, okay, we did 4 sets here and now we do 3, 2, 1, for example. Like, and it kind of,
Hmm.
comes down in a linear fashion or progressive fashion. And then there's another like concept around exponential tapers, which is more you can have the fast decay, which drops off quickly, and the slow decay, which goes a little bit slower, but then rapidly drops off at the end. So it's kind
Hmm.
of like they're different approaches to the thing. But most powerlifters, in terms of the research we've done, will tend to use a step taper. And I think it predominantly comes back to it being extremely simple to implement. Um, because it's just so easy, right?
Yeah.
Like you're like, okay, cool, we're cruising along at a pretty steady level. And maybe sometimes though, that second to last session that you talked about, like if you have an A and a B session, for example, your A session or your primary session might be slightly reduced compared to what you would have done 2 weeks out. But then
Hmm.
you have that big drastic drop off in that B session or that secondary session prior to the meet, while
Yeah.
still maintaining a level of intensity. And I think that is kind of that is my bias with tapering. Like I have always favored a taper that is of a higher intensity. And it probably comes back to my own experience. Like I was training in a way where I was, basically doing heavy. It was a ridiculous program I was doing at the time. I was just playing around with stuff, but I was doing like back squats Monday, Wednesday, Friday, front squats Tuesday, Thursday. And I would do, I think it was like, was it 2 weeks on, 1 week down, like two up weeks, two
Hmm.
down weeks. And so it might have been like 3 work sets across the board for those 2 weeks of it. And I'd try and build. And then the next week I would drop back to like one set. And I remember the week of my 1 set week, like it wasn't a planned taper at all. Like, it was just like there was a meet that week and someone's like, you should jump in. Like I had a really, really good meet, but those ones were like, sorry, those single sets that I did in that week were still heavy. Like they were really, quite heavy
Right.
compared to what I had ever done in the past before that in terms of my tapering approach. Like I'd typically gone quite light the week of a meet. And so that was a different experience. I came in like, and I was like, oh, that went really, really well, right? And that kind of like, I guess, has biased me towards slightly higher intensity tapers because those were
Yeah.
hard
Same.
sets, like a hard 1 set, but done after that. Like literally build to that, done. You might have your 1 set of accessory after that, and that was it. And I'm like, that's really interesting. Like, and it was just an accidental experience because it was a meet that was close. Someone said you should come have a go, and I had one of my best meets that I'd had up until that time, and I'm like, I wouldn't recommend the squatting, those 5 days per week of squatting, mate. Just so you know, like that's not a recommended approach, but it was something we were playing around with at the time, like trying some high frequency stuff. We were never doing that many sets in any one day, like blah blah blah.
Well,
Not saying I
I
recommend
will
that, but
say
just saying
like,
that was an interesting experience for me, especially like for how well it went.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I think it kind of comes back to the whole thing. It's kind of like about managing volume. Like one of the things I've
Yeah.
realized with like a lot of injuries, like it's like some of them are intensity based, mostly just like chronic workload of like how much you're
Mm.
doing. Like for myself, I've had some pretty consistent issues with like my quadratus lumborum SI joint area, and like for me, it's just like I just need to lower down the volume on squats, and then
Yeah.
I was self-managing with like other things,
Do other stuff to
and
get the legs right.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's like that's just too much like fatigue. And it was like I had a really good podcast with David Wilson. Like he said one thing, he's like I think people overestimate how like fatiguing RP10 is. If you're all you did
Mm.
in the gym and you did RP10 set and you went home, like I don't think you'd have problems. But it's like
Well,
everything
well,
else that
that
you're
comes
doing
back to
like
that
in
minimum
between.
minimum dose training, mate, right? That
Right.
we were talking about before. Like that was basically Dr. Pack's experience with the research they did. Like they were benching, I think, 3 times a week, squatting twice a week, and deadlifting once. And one of the groups built up to like a near maximal set basically every time they went into the gym, but that was it. You know,
It works, yeah.
and they
I
got
do it with a lot
stronger
of my
with
a
that.
lot of my a
Like
lot of my
it's a really
lifters, yeah.
interesting. Yeah, like you have the intensity. I mean, there probably needs to be a baseline level of strength and a baseline level of capability at the movements, to really do something like that. And would it work for longer term? Because I think they did about 6 weeks. Maybe, maybe not. But like it doesn't fatigue you that much, and you can get in and get that done really, really quickly. And it's actually a really good maintenance um, dosage of training as well. But
It's
as
fun.
the research that he did, I'd strongly recommend going and having a look at some of Dr. Pack's stuff. And we wrote an article for Stronger by Science called what is it? Something about the time poor lifter. Um,
Yeah.
so look that up about time poor lifting for the
Put that
time poor
in
or
the
something like that
notes.
on the Stronger by Science page. But there's some good information in there around those studies that they did. But yeah, I think what you're getting to, right, is the level of fatigue that actually, if you do one set of hard work and you're done, you can actually feel pretty good after that, right? Like it's not going to absolutely destroy you. Whereas if you did, and I always use this as the example, but it's obviously not a logical comparison. But if you did one hard, heavy set, right, maximal effort compared to doing like a 10 by 10 volume training, of course the 10 by 10 volume training is going to destroy you more. Like, it's just it's just the way it is. And especially with strength athletes, if we're not used to doing high volume. So it kind of makes sense. I don't know if I've gone a bit too far off course with that one there, mate.
No,
But
no,
you
that
know,
I think that that's a really, really great point because mm, like that's again the kind of goes back to like what's driving strength, right? At the end of the day, it's that intensity. And I think that like you've seen like the pendulum swing with powerlifting, where like when the DUP came out, it was all volume, 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 and
mm,
then it kind of went to like more the high intensity when like Juggernaut method came out, and Bulgarian, and then now it's kind of going back to like the volume, and now it's kind of going back to intensity. And you kind of
yeah,
say like
yeah,
these
and the
pendulums kind
frequency
of
stuff
always
as
like
well at the moment.
exactly.
Yeah,
And then you have like guys like Thomas Lilly who are like I do once a week, squat, bench, and deadlift. There's always like these extremes. I think it just comes down to
yeah,
like I think it's good to understand like what the mechanisms, right? Just like understand like what's going on. That's why I think that scientists are important having like people like you doing this research is that even though we don't have like any formal like all the data that we need on powerlifters, it's not cancer. I think it's pretty important. But like it's one of those things where it's like a guiding thing that we can kind of go off of, and
yeah,
then you just individualize from there. It's kind of like anybody who's done the coaching for a long enough time. Like I'm going to be honest with you, like I will customize training, but I have like a general template like what I think is going to work. And it's just about individualizing based off of like guess and check, and understanding, okay, they're reporting this, that I need to change this. And I think that with far tapering go, it's just like those are very broad guidelines. It's like maintain intensity as high as you need to like like retain your
yeah, yeah,
strength, and then lower down volume as much as you need to like not feel like complete crap and not detrain. And that's kind of
yeah,
like something that you can only like really know by experimenting with. I will say like in general, like with
yeah,
like what you said about like 70, like the 30 to 70%, like I would probably say like deadlift like 30 to 50% of max of like of the volume that I would do on the squat 50 to 70%. Bench press, it's like I would even do like 70 to 90%, depending on like the person. Like I might not even
mm,
percent their volume like that much. And with the intensity, it's just like I'm just going to maintain it like we regularly would.
yeah.
Second
And then,
last week
like
of
to be fair,
training.
mate, like my kind of like principles around tapering are like that 30 to 70% volume reduction, maintain intensity, as needed for the athlete. Some people say lower it slightly, some people say increase it slightly, some people say maintain. So intensity is kind of a little bit more variable, but don't play with it too much like you have for their volume. Take 1 or 2 weeks typically is really what's going to be needed for most powerlifters, and then stop training a few days out. Like it's those would be your big guiding, principles when it comes to tapering, but then there's so much room to move, within that recommendation or within those principles. There's so far you can go within that, so take that as a guiding light, but make those changes and make those individualized aspects as much as you can within that too. And you as the coach are the one who's going to, be able to know and learn that from your past experiences as well, because that trial and error piece you mentioned, super, super important.
Yeah, I guess like wrap things up going on off of that. Like, what are some like big, I guess, kind of gave your practical insights there, but like, are there anything like you really think that coaches like let's say let's I guess like wrap things off. Say that you had a taper that went just really bad. Like,
Mm,
how would you analyze that? And then how would you identify was that the taper or was that the training leading up to that
yeah,
taper?
that's a good question because yeah, the training and the taper kind of have to go hand in hand, right? So the easiest thing to tell if a taper worked was were they lifting more or less than what they lifted in the gym. Like some athletes though, and this is again where the athlete piece is important, right? So if everything fell off a cliff and they didn't go well in that meet, they didn't hit what you had expected based on E1RMs or hitting PRs or whatever it was that was your guiding light, something went wrong. And then when you look into that, you'd probably want to look at how did they feel prior to the taper. If they were feeling like rubbish already, and they didn't perform to expectations on the meet, maybe that was a training thing, and the taper can't solve everything, right? It's 1 to 2 weeks. So if you've really overcooked them prior to that, there's not a whole lot that's going to necessarily rescue that, right? There is, if you've just gone too far here, 1 week's probably not going to be enough to change the damage that you've done there, I guess. So looking at performance is going to be your most objective measurement because that's all that we really care about, right? Like at the end of the day,
Right.
if you're a powerlifter, you're a strength athlete, I don't care if you felt really good on meet day. If you perform like crap, like something didn't work. And then it's probably looking at some of like, firstly, I would say the main thing you want to check when you've looked at that taper and you've said it wasn't a success because performance might have decreased what we saw before. What happened during that week life wise? Because first you want to rule out that was it something external to your actual training plan? Did they have a higher stress week that week at work? Was it lack of sleep because of something that went wrong? Did the travel to the meet affect them potentially? Did you not change something, or they didn't feel fresh because they hadn't actually moved once they got to the venue?
Mm,
Travel, diet, all of those other aspects you kind of want to have a look at just to say, right, all this stuff was pretty normal. So it means that it was something within this component. And then look at, okay, last time we did this and that worked pretty well, but we went with a higher intensity this time because Hayden and Adam told me that higher intensity is good and it didn't work. Okay, well, maybe for this lifter, we don't want to do that. Or, hey, I carried, my accessory work on and it went really, really well. So therefore, I know next time I should be keeping some accessory work in there. So it's kind of like you're going to have to take a little bit of an analytical approach and start from first, was it anything external that affected it? Because that's going to be like priority number one. If stress or nutrition or sleep, whatever was really poor during that week, well, that's something that you probably need to change before you judge the taper too hard. And then it's trying to have those comparison points back to what you've done before. And that could be back to we've done a maximum test in training before, and this was what the week before max test looked like. But we changed heaps of stuff compared to that in the taper. And now we saw a different response. We saw that everything went backwards. Whereas when I did that max test, it went better. Well, what did you do differently within those two things? And that's kind of going to be because they're an individual, you are going to have to look at stuff that you've seen repeatedly with them before. And you could do the exact same thing with the training block, right? Like what type of training did we do that led to PRs last time? Analyze that.
mhm.
What sort of exercises were included? What sort of rep ranges we're using? What sort of intensities we're using? If that's all changed over here, okay, well, maybe that's our problem. We need to come back and have a look at what like things they responded well to as an individual. So again, sorry, man, like I'm always
No,
really broad
that's
brushstrokes because there's always so much nuance in this, but it is that would kind of be the approach that I would take is look at the externals, then start comparing with what we've done before and what was the outcome last time. And then kind of, step by step, look at things like the intensity, the exercise selection, the amount of volume that you did. Did you cut back too much? They felt really fresh, but they performed poorly. Did you not cut back enough? They
right,
turned up feeling beat up. Like, looking for those signs that would indicate either way
right.
as well, and then tracking that signal against what you have seen before for that person.
I think that's a great way to go about it. Like, they're just like, did you feel like really good? You just felt weak. Okay, we probably reduced down too much
Mm,
volume and or intensity. Did you come in, you felt just like really beat up still, and it's like, man, I just feel like I don't really want to lift. Like everyone knows what that feeling is. And then it's like, okay, and then you go kind of like go somewhere like in the middle of those two. And then as far as training, it's like, well, how did they feel? Did they feel really, really beat up? And the numbers were starting to nosedive pretty hard, or were they continually getting stronger and things were fine? It's like, okay, you probably like over tapered them, right? I
mm,
guess one last thing I wanted to mention because this came across by my mind. how would weight cutting affect your taper strategy? When we talk about externals, that's a huge
Yeah.
one.
Yeah. And that's probably one of the ones that you probably can't practice as much unless you
Yeah.
do smaller like events. Like if you have like an A meet over here that you want to do, that's the big one, and you've never cut weight before, you probably do want to test that at say a local meet or a lower level event at some stage to see how you respond, or in training as with a testing day, potentially do like a mini cut and see how you respond because yeah, there's potential for that to be a whole nother can of worms, mate. And then you combine weight cutting with new food in a different city or whatever it is, all of those things that can come into play. And that's why tapering, we can study it in the lab and we can have a look at what we've seen. But actually, when you start adding all of these layers onto what it actually looks like for an athlete in a certain environment, like it can be really hard. But I do think again, the same thing is going to be you're probably going to have practiced it. If they've never done it before, you're probably going to have to try and keep the stuff as normal as possible, maybe reduce things by a little bit more because just think of it as you're adding a whole nother stress
Yeah.
to that athlete during that week. So maybe the sensible approach is just, what has worked in the past. Maybe just take a little bit more of a conservative approach initially when they do that weight cut the first time and just scale things back a little bit more, 20% more, whatever it might be,
That's
so
exactly what
that
I
you
would do.
kind of at
Yep.
least give them the best opportunity to succeed. Because it will feel different. The other part that then comes into that is how do they actually feel like, belt fitting wise, all of those different things on the day. But that's more of a performance component necessarily than a tapering
Yeah,
component.
that's
But the
less a
things to think
taper.
about. Yeah.
I will say, like for me, what I've usually found for myself is like typically there just needs to be a little more of a volume reduction through if we are
Mm,
planning on that. Just because, and I still keep the intensity high, but it's just because like I still think about it like this, like you're still like recovering and adapting to some extent from like the training that you're doing
mm,
before and so that taper
yeah.
training. And like I don't agree with the idea that you're not getting stronger during the taper week. I think you are. I
Mm,
think it's the only way you can express that strength is you're literally getting stronger. Like
yeah.
it's all like it's like with the whole like muscle protein synthesis thing. It's like you're not like it's not like an on and off switch. It's a dimmer of like what's happening.
I'd
Like
just
are
say
you
it's like
recovering more? Or
marginal
are you?
gains though, right? Like
Oh,
you're
for
not going to
sure.
gain 10% in that taper week purely off your
Yeah,
off
you're
your
not. It's
adaptations
it,
from that week,
it's
It's going
fatigue.
to be
Yeah,
the masking fatigue is gone and that, you know, 0.5%, whatever it might be that you still do gain that week because you're still training, you still get to experience that. So yes, I would agree in principle with what you're saying there. I guess it's just the magnitudes of those changes that kind of
for sure.
make sense there.
Well, cool, Hayden. I really appreciate you coming on. This is awesome to talk to you. I guess how can people find you, hire you for coaching, follow you along to your 300 kilo deadlift journey? That's a big milestone to hit.
Just yeah, head to at HJP Method on Instagram. That's probably the best place, and it's the same um, words or whatever for the website. Just hjpmethod.co.nz, so not .com,
Okay.
.co.nz. So yeah, HJP Method is that. It's just my initials and then the word method. So yeah,
Well, that's easy enough. And that's like my email, adamdpo@gmail.com. Very easy.
keep it simple, mate.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much for everyone for listening, and we'll catch you in the next one.
Awesome, mate. Thank